Hello, and welcome to this month's Worksmith Community Talk. We're talking coffee this time around, and specifically about how we can pay more for coffee. I'm chuffed to be joined with Aislinn Cullen from Melbourne Coffee Merchants and Julie Kerr from Cafe Imports Australia, both who have had extensive careers in coffee and most recently connected to the importing of green coffee to roasters in Australia. It's sort of what happens backstage that matters most. And for the coffee industry, the goings on at origin level is often misunderstood or underappreciated. Transparency is often difficult to attain. Front and center for most people who work within the sort of specialty wedge of coffee is the cost of coffee and the unfortunate plateauing of the price paid for green coffee. There are, of course, many reasons why, and while we're not here to solve the decades-long problem, we are here to explore what the current challenges are facing producers across the globe. And perhaps we can pass on some tips on how to buy coffee more responsibly, whether you're a roaster or whether you buy coffee for your cafe or if you're just a coffee lover at home. So most people tuning in are likely from our Worksmith audience, and their connection with coffee might not be as firsthand as most people who work directly with coffee. So this is a really good opportunity for us to talk to those who perhaps aren't strictly or directly involved, but nonetheless are buyers of coffee. So before we jump in, I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank our partners at Worksmith, who are Zero, Square, ALM, Chef's Hat, Kookaburra, and Mercedes-Benz Vans. They're great supporters and help put us in a bit better position and help us put these talks on. First up, though, I'd like to thank you, Julie and Aislinn, for joining me today. But I think what would be best to do first up would be just to get a little sense or rundown of your journeys in coffee. And maybe we should start with A for Aislinn. So if you just want to let us know, Aislinn, how you kind of got into coffee and maybe sort of what keeps you in coffee as well.
Yeah, so I started as a barista back in the day, just working in different cafes around the place. And when I was in my early 20s, I moved to the States and got a part-time job with a roastery there called Blue Bottle Coffee, which has become quite big, but at the time it was really tiny. But it was the first time that I had kind of cupped coffee or, tasted different processing methods. And it really kind of opened my eyes to a potential of a career in coffee. I didn't stay there. I was in California at the time. I came back to Australia, but I did end up in New York about 2 years later and got a job with Blue Bottle. And I worked for them for about 5 years in their training department, which was an amazing way to learn a lot more about coffee, because when you teach it, you have to know it really well. Mm-hmm. And then decided it was time to move back to Australia. Initially, I worked for a wholesale roaster here, which was a great way to kind of land in Melbourne. I'd never lived or worked in Melbourne before. And build a bit of a coffee network. And then I've been working with MCM for the past 4 years, which has been amazing. I always really wanted to be on the green side of things. I find it really fascinating. And I loved the idea of getting more information and closer to kind of producing communities and understanding that side of stuff a lot more. So it's been wonderful to work here. And I think in terms of what keeps me in coffee, I think coffee is such a great industry to work in because there are so many possibilities there are so many avenues to pursue. There's so much that you can learn about. And there seems to be like a continuous path of learning. And then I think the other thing is it's just, as much as the industry is made up of coffee, it's made up of really amazing and wonderful people. And I really like to work with people. So it's a great way to do that.
Great. Yeah, it definitely it's helpful if you enjoy working with people in coffee, that's for sure. It's
necessary.
it's heavily sort of based in the land of different communities, whether that be at ground level here in Melbourne or the producers and exporters that you're working with. Yeah, that's great. And what about you, Jill? Where did you come across coffee for the first time, and what are you doing here?
So I had a kind of similar journey, I think, to Aislinn, in the fact that I started working in coffee. I got a job as a barista, I think, as most people do in their late teens, early 20s, and you don't really look at it as a career path, so to speak. And then you get a little bit more involved. I moved to work for a roaster. I spent about 8 years with them here in Melbourne. They're heavily certified, so B Corp, Fair Trade Organic certifications there, carbon neutral. So I got to learn about that part of the sustainability side of the business. And then cupping coffee, learning more about quality control. And I got to the point where I was like thinking about my next step, and I thought, I think I want to learn more about green coffee. So I took some time off, took a few months off, and then Cafe Imports had a job available, and that was 5 years ago. So it's interesting. The people are definitely what keep me here. The product's pretty good, like it's an added bonus. And I think it's also the thing where you think you know a lot about coffee, and then you hear about something else and you're like, actually, I don't know anything about coffee. And it's very humbling, I think, in that sense. And yeah, just that relationship that you are able to build from producer, exporter. You learn a lot about logistics. And then going to a cafe and drinking coffee is pretty special if you've seen it on a tree. So yeah.
Yeah, nice. I guess you both sort of saddle right in the middle of the seesaw, where you're pretty connected to all the way through to the cafe side of things through roasters, and then all the way back to farmers and producers as well. So you've sort of got that view of both sides of the fence or something. So yeah, it's a really interesting place to be. So you've obviously then both worked as baristas. Back then, I don't want to say or guess how many years ago that was, but what was the price of a flat white, for instance, and kind of what year was it or thereabouts? Recall?
I feel like it was around the $3.50 mark. So not that far off where it is now.
Yeah.
I would say it was probably around 20 years ago when I first started working as a barista. It would have been $3.20, I think. And you know, I started working in coffee in Brisbane, so a little bit of a different market to here in Melbourne. Also, specialty coffee wasn't actually a thing that was very accessible back then. So there weren't very many people buying, you know, super delicious coffees where there had been a lot of energy put into the sourcing of those coffees as well. So I think that's something interesting to consider when you think about that price point.
I got my start in Adelaide, and I was woefully underinformed about coffee. Like I remember the day where I realized that coffee came from somewhere else, you know, like I had to think about where it came from for the first time. And thinking back to that, like that was just the accepted level of, you know, understanding or information that a barista making flat whites had, you know.
Yeah. We were exposed to brands, weren't we, rather than farmers or producers or even origins or regions. I think I remember it exactly the same way. That's for sure. Yeah. So isn't it, I mean, for me, it's still really shocking to think back to those days of serving coffee, and the price was around about the same, $3.50. I seem to recall $3.20 for some reason as well. So yeah, it's pretty astonishing that here we are 20 odd years later, and we've not really budged too much. You look at other things like beer in pubs or wine in restaurants, and the sort of much higher prices we are happy to pay for those products. And for some reason, coffee has sort of languished at at this non-movable price point. Do you think that there's any particular reasons for that stalling?
I think here, like, it's seen as a very homogenous product. Like a flat white from Cafe A is pretty similar to a flat white from Cafe B, and so, you know, there's no kind of understanding of the different variants of quality that you can get, or the work and the effort that go into it. So I think for cafe owners, even if they're buying really good grain or buying really good roasted coffee and putting a lot of effort into, you know, producing something that's a really quality product, they're still scared to move the price up, or wary of moving the price up, because you can get what is seen as the same product at the cafe down the street for, you know, maybe 50 cents to $1 cheaper. So I think there's a real hesitancy around increasing the price.
Yeah.
Yep.
I agree with that. I think from my experience, cafe owners are very scared to increase that price because it's the one thing that will draw people in, right? So if they put the price of their coffee up to $4 or $4.50, the market, especially here in Melbourne, is so competitive that you do have 3 other options within 300 metres.
Yeah.
Which makes it very difficult.
Yeah. And we know that hospitality in general is in a really tricky time right now. And I think that it's compounding that issue even further. People are obviously attempting to make cost savings where possible, and with a shortage of staff as well, there's a lot of issues there. I guess we're not necessarily here to dive into that. I think that's a whole nother talk altogether. And I think it'd be much better to hear your sort of expertise, I suppose, in what you're doing right now in buying coffee and selling it on. And I think that something that I'd like to kind of touch on is, and maybe keeping it fairly in layman's terms, so to speak, is the sort of process of how you work and how coffee is actually traded. One of the sort of buzzwords, I guess, that we get in the specialty wedge of coffee is direct trade coffee. And I was hoping to get a bit of a take from both of you on what your interpretation of direct trade coffee actually is, and whether that falls in the laps of importers as well as roasters working directly with farms.
Sure.
There's about 3 questions in that, sorry.
Take those punches.
Look, my interpretation of direct trade is a coffee roaster will go to origin, they will partner with the producer, they'll make a commitment to buying their coffee, and then they will also facilitate any logistics back to Australia, wherever they're located. And so they have that direct partnership. However, I do also have the experience where roasters will go to origin, they will partner with a producer, and then they might lean on their importer to help them facilitate that logistics back to Australia. Because once you open that logistics kettle, can of worms, it gets pretty complicated and expensive, to be honest with you.
So, Aislinn, how do roasters then create those relationships directly with farmers or producers through importers? And is that sort of thing encouraged?
Yeah, I think Jules makes a good point about the cost of exporting and importing coffee. If you want to do it cost efficiently, then it makes a lot more sense to do it in volume, larger volume. So move a container of coffee rather than a micro lot of coffee. I think when people are kind of looking for direct trade, it's a really loosely defined term and everyone kind of has their own version of it. But really, I think at the heart of it, in its purest form, people are just looking for a relationship between the producing community and then the roaster or the party who is kind of serving the coffee to the final consumer. And that can absolutely be facilitated through an importer and an exporter. You need those parties in the supply chain just to move coffee from point A to point B, but they can also bring a lot of value to the table. They can help develop that relationship, facilitate that relationship. They can look after the logistics because it's almost another business. It's another level of expertise that's needed there. They can finance the coffee. They can get a lot of traceability information on your behalf, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if you are working with quality-focused exporters and importers, there is a way to kind of achieve that direct connection or that direct relationship, but a whole lot of really complicated logistics and expensive logistics are going to be taken care of on your behalf. And not only that, but that they'll also add value to the product. So yeah, I definitely think finding companies that you feel aligned with and kind of share goals with is probably the most efficient way to do coffee.
Yeah. And I guess most recently we've been kind of unable to travel to Origin as much as we'd kind of like to. And I feel like one of the criteria, I guess, for direct trade in some respects or in some definitions of the term is to be visiting the producer. Do you think that that's a real necessary part of forming that relationship?
It definitely helps. It definitely helps to have visited the producers. We were really, as far as COVID goes, we were really fortunate and felt very grateful that we had already visited all of the countries that we buy from multiple times, and that we had existing close relationships with all of the producers that we work with, because it is just a lot more efficient to kind of get the kind of information that you want or get the decisions that you want made when you're doing it in person, and to feel that kind of level of alignment and trust and relationship building. It's a lot slower and a lot less efficient to do it at arm's length. And it definitely helps to have that relationship already. So yeah, it helps, but I don't think it's 100% necessary in order to trade coffee in a way that feels responsibly.
Yeah, well, it feels like anything that we do, and it's something that I've rediscovered, I suppose, in having meetings in person again, is they're unbelievably efficient compared to email chains or Zoom calls or whatever. And so I can understand that having developed a relationship over multiple years, some of which has been in person and some of which has been, online or whatever, is sort of vital to to getting to that point. Julie, have you had any kind of sense of what producers or cooperatives feel about what direct trade means to them? And if it's a term that they are aware of? This is speaking incredibly generally, of course.
Yeah. I think there's definitely pros for the producers, and they understand this, that we work with. So they see this as an opportunity for them to maybe sell one grade of coffee but present other grades of coffee that they have available. So it's a more sustainable supply chain for them. Long term, they're also putting a lot of trust in that relationship, though. So that's something else that I think people need to be mindful of when they're buying coffee. If you're going to a producer and you're saying, I want to buy a container of coffee off you every year, you're kind of committing for more than a year, to be honest with you. It's it's a lot of effort that goes into producing that product. Financing at the origin end is very difficult. The producers generally would only get paid once per year. A lot of importers will offer microfinancing to the producer partners. So I think that's the feedback that I've had and I've experienced. There's also amazing stories where, you know, you see people develop these relationships and you see them either visit the farm every year, or during COVID, they're on WhatsApp, they're, you know, on Zoom, they're emailing. You know, you get to know each other. It's like any business relationship when you work with people for a long period of time. You see them have children, you know, it's more than just a product. It's also like an emotional attachment to coffee as well. And you definitely see that when people go to a farm and meet a producer in person, that sticks with you. It sticks with me every time I travel, and I'm sure for both of you as well. So
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think just adding to that, like that idea of a long-term commitment is so important in those relationships, because it's so much easier for a producer to know that they're growing coffee and they already have a committed buyer for that product. It's a lot less stressful and scary. So really, like, committing to relationships through slight fluctuations in quality and making sure that you're constantly communicating, you know, those things really support that relationship building.
Yeah. I mean, like you say, Julie, the first time I went to Origin, it was, I wasn't really there to make hard and fast decisions about what, at the time it was with Tim Wendelbo. It wasn't for me to make those calls, but I was a bit of a passenger at that point. But it without question changed the way I thought about the entire industry, and it was an incredibly helpful and sort of fast track to understanding that concept of relationship and how that is built over time and not from a fly in, fly out sort of situation. Yeah. So just going across then to a few extra terms that I think that are important, I think, to cover because they're often raised with transparency reports that a lot of roasters are now publishing for people to get a little insight into how they work and how they pay for their green coffee and how they work with their partner producers. One of the terms people often use is Farmgate pricing, and then the second to that is FOB or free on board pricing. Can you explain to me what those terms mean and what that means to producers and exporters and importers? Please, Julie. Julie, you can do Farmgate, and then Aislinn, you can do free on board.
So Farmgate is the price that a producer will receive for their coffee when they deliver it. You know, this is based on many things. It could be based on the C market that particular day. There could be additional premiums added to that based on the quality of the product. So that is the price that the farmer will receive for the coffee. So basically, you know, that's the cost of their production, because that's how they're selling their product.
And when you say deliver it, in what form is the coffee in at that point, and where are they actually delivering it?
So the coffee would have been processed, so it's either a washed coffee or a natural coffee. They might be delivering it to a local warehouse in the area of an exporter who might blend that coffee together. They might separate some higher quality lots out from others. And you know, these warehouses long-term play an important role. They get to know the producers. If we can't be there on the ground, they can help the producers identify higher quality coffee that normally might get blended into something else. So yeah, that's the price. That's what Farmgate pricing is in a simplified term.
Yeah.
However, the Farmgate price isn't the same everywhere. So there's a lot of other things that you need to consider. the Farmgate price in Colombia obviously will be different to what it is in, say, Guatemala. There's local currency to think of when we talk about these prices as well. So I think that's important to include in the conversation.
Yeah.
And then free on board?
So free on board is the price of the coffee that the importer pays to the exporter. So once the coffee has been picked, processed, dried, and then milled and prepared for export, so put into bags and stuffed into a shipping container, or picked, and it's the price that we pay the exporter for that product. So it's at port, it's ready to be transported on a shipping container, in a shipping container to Australia. And that price, again, is informed by a lot of different factors. Sea market, what the daily market price is doing is really significant. But then also the quality of the cup, the scarcity of the type of coffee that we're buying, the cost of production in that particular country can be a really big factor. So yeah, that price will change according to kind of the actual product that we're buying, whether it's a really special micro lot or something that came from a regional blend made up of 10 to 20 producers. But in its short term, and we pay that price in US dollars per pound. So then that needs to be then converted to Australian dollars per kilogram. Exactly.
Yeah. So what do you often see then in I guess they're called transparency reports that roasters will publish, is the Farmgate price or the FOB price compared to the sea market price or fair trade prices. Sometimes it feels like a bit of an, of course it's more expensive than sort of the bottom of the barrel, and not to diminish at all what people do in publishing these figures, but what do we think is the best way to sort of understand what those prices mean beyond the comparison to the sea market or fair trade? Are there other markers that can be used from area to area?
I mean, I think it's really hard because the FOB price uncontextualized doesn't really mean that much, particularly when it's compared to commodity pricing, because like you say, you're kind of comparing apples to oranges. Like if you compare it to commodity pricing and then you're kind of discounting the additional labor and cost that goes into producing a premium product. So yeah, FOB I think it's an easy one because it's kind of like all coffee is traded at some point in US dollars per pound. So it's easy to compare it to commodity, but it really needs to be contextualized with the information around where that coffee is coming from, the cost of production in that country, the quality of that country, the lot size, et cetera, et cetera. We contribute to something called the Specialty Coffee Transaction Guide, which is it's a data collection. Basically, data is donated by different importers and exporters and roasters to kind of build a price reference for producers who want to know what their coffee could be worth. And that's been really interesting. They take the data and they anonymize it and they put it into like a big they publish a guide every year, and it's been really illuminating to kind of see where we sit in that guide, and to see it. I mean, I think it's interesting. It's like all specialty roasters and importers and exporters that contribute to it. So it doesn't really reference commodity. And I think that's actually very meaningful and powerful for producers who want to be selling coffee into a premium or specialty market. So that's one interesting way that we've kind of followed the transparency path without publishing FOB.
Yeah. I think as well, there's situations where publishing the Farmgate price of a coffee could potentially do damage to the producer.
Yeah.
You're not their only partner at origin if they're selling to this exporter and maybe another exporter, or through one exporter to multiple different counterparties. but have a different pricing bracket across those relationships, I think, it can be quite damaging if, we're coming out and we're saying, oh, this farmer gets paid this Farmgate price through these people, and then someone else might publish something and it's a different Farmgate price. I think that could be doing more harm than good, because then that creates this tension between clients, basically, and it's difficult.
Yeah. It could put unintended downward pressure on the price.
Yeah.
So we're cautious about that as well. Yeah.
Is there any examples of a similar, I probably should have done my research, but any examples of similar transparency on pricing in any other industries? Do we recognize that?
Maybe coca?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I didn't do that as pre-research either, but I see that, that industry is very close to coffee. They're grown, the producers grown in similar climates. So that might be heading on the same trend. Also, specialty chocolate is, having that same upward trend as what coffee has.
I think fashion has really come a long way when you look at brands like Kauai or Kowtow that publish where their fabrics are coming from. They've got photos of the factories where the products are made. They open up their books on pricing. I think that actually a lot of those more progressive brands are doing a really, really good job with it. And there's a lot to learn and be influenced by in that particular industry. There's another one that is rocking around in my brain, but I can't remember what it is.
Yeah, that's really good to know. I mean, I think I'm all for it, and there isn't a single solution that's going to fit across everybody. So anybody who is attempting to shine a light on how they work and be transparent about it, and for all the right reasons, then I'm definitely all for it. That's for sure. Yeah. So I think I'd like to just jump across now to talking a little bit about the last kind of couple of years, maybe, in the challenges that are facing many producing countries. I think that there's obviously environmental challenges. Obviously, COVID has been a big proponent, and political issues as well at certain countries. Julie, can you speak directly about some of the challenges you've witnessed by exporters and producers in Colombia, for instance?
Yeah, sure. So obviously COVID has been impacted everyone worldwide. I guess, in somewhere like Colombia, the areas where coffee is grown, they may not have greater access as what we have to healthcare. So my experience was that coffee producers were a little bit hesitant to leave their areas to deliver coffee. So, that's one impact. Also, there's a large migration population that picks coffee. I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding that the coffee farmer or the producer, as we might refer to them as, is the one on the farm picking all the coffee. Like any farm, they depend on employees, and similar to what we have in Australia, where, you may not be able to get enough staff to pick the coffee cherries when they're ready to be picked. Colombia specifically has had a lot of political unrest, which has normally really been contained in the major cities, where we've seen people in the countryside, protesting and closing down streets and things like that. And, shipping is a nightmare pretty much for any industry trying to get things from one side of the world to another. So we've seen, as a roll-on effect from the political issues in Colombia, where ports have been closed down, there's now not enough shipping containers to get the coffee onto the boat to, get it on the water. So it's been particularly challenging in that sense.
What have typically been the changes in shipping costs for a container to come from somewhere to Melbourne?
Look, I think we've been quite lucky in Australia where the shipping costs haven't blown out as much as what they have on shipping routes from South and Central America to, say, the US. But, you know, it's going up by significant amounts of money, which is difficult to absorb. And it also doesn't mean that you're going to get the coffee faster. You might have a booking in for a coffee in, say, November. It will get rolled to the next month. It's still not 100% certain that it's going to leave in December. You might offer, you know, if we pay a higher freight cost, can we get it here faster? And it's not certain. There's so many uncertainties around it at the moment. As I said, I think we've been quite lucky in our location where we haven't had to weather as much of the freight costs as, you know, Cafe Imports has an office in the US where they're finding it a little bit more challenging. Yeah.
And Aislinn, I just saw that you've got a container coming from Guatemala that may have been a little delayed or held.
Landed now, but so that container left Guatemala in June and got stuck at a port in Shanghai for 4.5 months. And there's just nothing you can do about it, you know, and it's not like it gets to Shanghai and they say, okay, it's going to leave in 4 months. It's you continuously make bookings and then they continuously get rolled. So you're constantly pushing back on when you're expecting the coffee.
Like my holiday to Windsor.
Exactly. And that it's really unpredictable right now. It's just because there aren't enough spaces on ships. Everything's really out of sync kind of in the global shipping cycle right now. And it means that some ports have, you know, lots of empty containers and no place to unpack new containers, and some have no empty containers and you can't get your freight into a container and onto a ship. So it's been very, very challenging, and we're expecting it to last for a while longer.
And Aislinn, I know that you work across quite a few countries, but I think Brazil and Rwanda have faced kind of unique challenges themselves.
Brazil obviously was really hard hit by COVID, and that's been pretty grueling on the communities that we work with. But similar to what Jules was saying about Colombia, like they rely on pickers, and there's been labour shortages at the farms. Happily, the two larger estates that we work with, they are large enough and remote enough that they can just set up kind of camps on site and the pickers stay there throughout the picking season. But there's a lot of increased cost of production with COVID measures. So even just, you know, having to finance masks and hand sanitizer and washing stations and all the rest of it. And then that kind of temporary accommodation has increased the price of coffee, the price of producing coffee. And then Brazil, outside of COVID, has suffered some really bad weather events this last year. So they had, they're in the middle of a drought now in a lot of producing regions, but they also had very severe frosts in June, which basically the trees were frostbitten and they can't absorb sunlight to produce cherries. So they lost about 30% of their crop through those frosts, which is devastating. The outcome of that is that the market price for coffee has soared. So it almost doubled in, you know, the space of the week after the frosts. And that is great for producers who are selling coffee now because they're making more money off of their crop, which is something that we want to see and we hope is sustained. But it kind of, that volatility in the market makes it very difficult for exporters and importers because you're kind of chasing your tail in terms of pricing and you know, you're trying to price stabilize plus the cost of the shipping costs. It also has made it for our exporting partners. We work with a company there called AgriCoffee, and they're amazing and very quality focused, and they do a lot of work in a producing region called Piata, where it's mostly small farmers, so they might just have a very small farm. And a lot of those farmers, you know, they're choosing to maybe not produce quality, like higher quality coffee this year because it requires a lot more work, but they can make as much for their coffee, you know, without adding that extra work, as they can make almost double what they made last year. Or, you know, like people are coming into town and offering cash on site, and so they're selling to those people rather than waiting to sell to our exporting partner, despite the fact that, you know, he's been buying coffee off of them at prices far, far above market price for 10 years. The kind of prospect of, you know, a cash in hand is really appealing to a farmer, particularly when you consider how volatile pricing for coffee usually is. Like if you've got a wodge of cash that's a sure thing, like you don't necessarily want to wait, you know, to sell somewhere else. So actually securing coffees that we love and that we've requested has been really challenging for them as well.
Yeah. And so, Julie, what have been the changes in how business actually operates for an importer over the past 2 years with all the impacts that we've just talked about?
I think we've been quite lucky. We have very long-term relationships with the people that we work with at Origin, the exporters and the producers. I think, you know, things have changed in the sense of we don't have people on the ground there, which has been a huge component of it. We're lucky because those long relationships have been such long-term relationships, we've been able to maintain contact. I think there's definitely, it's been challenging getting samples in a timely manner, things like that. Then that's another logistics point where FedEx or DHL or the local carrier there, you know, might be backed up as well. It's also been challenging, like seeing people go through COVID at their end, you know, like in countries where COVID has been in high numbers, and, you know, that's been difficult. That's been really difficult as well.
Yeah. So I guess, like, you know, the little tiny, I suppose it's very small, the specialty coffee community where we are after the highest quality possible is quite a small component to the wider coffee industry. And we're very driven by trends, I think. And I guess there's a desire to outdo each other and find the new variety or the new hot wine processing method that's now being used with coffee, and which I think is all great. And of course, there's some amazing things that come of that. Do you think that these efforts or these practices are maybe placed in the wrong area for the time being, or does that kind of experimentation and desire to find the next best thing, is that still important to the progression of coffee?
I think it depends who's driving it. I was having a conversation with our Colombian buyer the other day, and we were having this conversation around these innovative processes that are out there, who's driving it in the market. And I said, do producers still want to do this? Is it something that they want to spend their time on? Do they see it adds value to what they can offer? And he said to me, like, some of the producers love doing it when they're in a community where they've all been farming coffee in the same area for, a couple of generations. To see them try things and push their coffees and use these farming techniques that they never would have thought about 5 years ago, they're into it. They love it.
Yeah.
However, in saying that, they're not going to turn around and do 50 bags of that process. I think the Australian market definitely is still hungry for those types of coffees. And it's good to see the experimentation happen. I just don't think it would be a smart move to apply that particular processing risk across your entire production, or even, a large portion of it.
What about you, Aislinn? What do you think about it?
Yeah, we don't buy a lot of those types of lots, and when we do, it's driven by the producers, and it's stuff that they're really passionate about, and they really want to do that experimentation and invest a lot of time and resource and money into that experimentation. They are expensive, they're expensive to produce, so they end up very expensive on our list. And I think, just knowing that, like, it's reassuring to know that people still want them. So we do buy a few of them. And I think, on this end, they do play a role in kind of expanding people's understanding of what coffee can be and providing new experiences and getting new people kind of hooked on coffee. They're very distinct coffees. They can be really delicious. And so, I think kind of capturing a new audience for a different experience of coffee is a really positive thing. But I wouldn't necessarily weight our entire offer to that or expect it or ask for it from producers.
I think that's obviously a really important distinction, is that the desire to experiment and go through, carbonic maceration or whatever it might be, is being driven by the producer themselves, and they're inherently aware of the results of what that process will have on their coffee. So I think that's a really good distinction to make.
And I think you're going to get a better coffee that way. Because if someone's just kind of applying those techniques because they think that they're going to make a premium off it, there might be less, care or attention taken to those techniques. And sometimes they can go horribly, horribly wrong, and the coffee don't taste good. So I think, having a producer who's really invested the time and research into doing it well, that's where you get the best results from that experimental processing.
I think as well, the producers that are doing these experimental processes, when people are buying coffee, they should also remember, if they're putting that much time and energy into their experiments, imagine how amazing their standard wash coffees are. So I think, from a roaster point of view, when you are looking at those high-end coffees, think about the other stuff that they're doing, because they're so meticulous in that part of the process that is, going to be flowing through their entire farm.
Yeah. And I guess on all the way at the other side, back here in Cafe Land, Melbourne, obviously there's a higher cost of producing these coffees to the producer themselves, and then that trickles down onto all the way down to here at cafe level. And it seems that this is sort of a way of having people understand that there is different levels of quality and different levels of technique used to produce coffee that spreads the pricing window a little wider than what is $320 to $450 or whatever it is. So I think in that sense, it might be a good thing to help push the cost of a cup of coffee up a little higher, which kind of takes me to an anonymous attendee's question, which is, what's the risk to the specialty industry if we don't recognise the need to pricing at cafe level, an increase in pricing at cafe level?
I mean, coffee producers will just not grow coffee. They're growing coffee in the most fertile and lush land in the world. They can rip out their coffee trees and grow other products pretty easily. So if there isn't a future in coffee where they're making not just a livable wage off of their crop, but they're profiting off of their crop, they'll just choose a different crop. So I don't think we'll see no coffee, in 20 or 30 years, but we won't see such selected coffees that are produced with care and attention. And, where the product kind of leads to these really, really special relationships. I think that will start to not disappear, but there'll be less and less of it available. And it will be more and more expensive as a result.
I always think about a future a la Blade Runner, where it's you can get coffee, but it's some weird fabricated coffee, and then the actual coffee is like, you know, $1,000 a cup or something.
Yeah.
Not that I want that kind of future, but it could go that way.
Give us 200 years.
Yeah, that's right. I've also got a question from Anne Cooper, and her question is, any quality concerns because of the shipping delays in regards to the length of time stuck on a ship affecting the quality of specialty coffee? And do you foresee that the impacting changing price to the roasters themselves? I think that's a good question for you, Aislinn.
Yeah, definitely quality concerns with coffee being on the water for 4.5 months. So we were anticipating that these squats might land like a little bit more muted than we would like, beyond the fact that they've been in a shipping container or at port for so long. They are just 4.5 months further off harvest than we would usually expect to be landing them at. When that does happen, so a couple of the coffees landed with a little bit of, just not as vibrant and delicious as we would like. We just persevere to be as transparent about that as possible. So we get ahead of it. We inform our customers before they're tasting the coffee. And we usually will discount the coffee a little bit or a lot to kind of more accurately represent the cup quality that's landed. This is another reason that working with an importer can add a lot of value. It's a risk that the importer takes.
Right.
If you are doing direct trade and you already own the coffee that's on the water, you don't have the opportunity to either reject it or get a discount price for it once it lands.
So do you think then, though, that if you truly want to sort of adopt some sort of direct trade, not model, but like the ethics around direct trade, that you need to roll with the highs and lows?
Yeah, and to like a lot of our customers have, like a lot of those coffees, or some of those, the customers who bought those coffees are absolutely in it and understand that it should be a shared risk and have very graciously agreed to take the coffee. And maybe they won't use it as their showcase filter that they were expecting to use it for, but they can find somewhere in their lineup. And I think actually like taking that really transparent approach facilitates that decision making for the producer, for the roaster, because they we're so open about what's happening,
Yeah,
because I'm not above actually just asking, like, can you find somewhere in your lineup for this coffee?
Yeah. And I guess, Julie, there's also, you having been there for 5 years, you must be working with similar people for that time and creating relationships yourself. So have you found that to be a similar case for you, in people wanting to stick by producers that they've bought from for a long time?
Yeah, absolutely. I think people who, really involve themselves in that process, they have a holistic understanding of, it's not just a contract for this season, but it is a contract for the coming harvests as well. I think it's like anything, you get involved if you're communicating, that's the main thing.
Yeah.
And it's a natural product. There's going to be years where it's good. You're going to have good mangoes one year, you're going to have bad mangoes the other year. Like, the coffee's the same. I think sometimes there's a tendency in specialty coffee to get so wound up about quality and nuance and terroir of the coffee that people kind of forget about that. And if a coffee's been on a boat for 4 months and loses a tiny bit of sparkle, it's still going to be delicious. They're still good coffee.
Yeah. It started out as good coffee. It's still delicious coffee. Yeah.
100%. I've been following the Tim Wendelbo's farm in Colombia, Finca Suelo, I think it's called, and the direct, unbelievable challenges he has faced from being a sort of a part-time farmer, I suppose. And I think that's probably just solidified that approach for him to want to continue working with people through the bad times as well as the good times. And it's really great to see that you guys are doing the same thing as well.
I think it's also worth noting that relationship applies to the importer and the producing communities, but also the importer and your customer. Like, we have wonderful, loyal customers who, you know, they really understand what we do. They really value what they do. And they come to the table when stuff like this happens, and they don't want us to just accept all of that risk or loss. You know, they want to share that. So, yeah, there's definitely a lot of relationship building that happens here as well.
Yeah. So I've got one more question from Shane McGrath, which is kind of an interesting one. His question is, what role should an organisation like the Australian Specialty Coffee Association play in steering the conversation to the end consumers paying more per cup? Is that their role? I mean, I'm not entirely sure what their role is in the industry, but do we think that they should be a proponent for education?
I think it's a good question. I think it's difficult in Australia because, you know, the Specialty Coffee Association here, as far as my understanding is largely a volunteer group. I think, you know, education is the backbone of any of these kind of groups, really. So whether or not you're pressing and pushing people to make higher quality espresso coffee or filter coffee, I also think, you know, if people are understanding what they're drinking or what's in their flat white, and even if it's not a money factor, but if they understand all the steps that coffee cherry goes to get in your cup, they might understand, you know, and be a bit more accommodating of price rises. Yeah, perhaps that's something, you know, that they could shine a bit more of a light on. Obviously, though, they're all very busy, you know, volunteering their time. But yeah, I think it's an industry responsibility as a whole. You can't go pointing the finger at, you know, it's the barista's job to explain the coffee and the processes that it goes through and their extraction times. And, you know, we have to remember that over COVID in Australia as well, baristas have been like a godsend for a lot of people. They've been the one contact while they've been in lockdown. So I think it's more of an industry responsibility as opposed to an organisation.
Yeah. Totally second that. I think it's kind of across the board, anything that we can do to inform or add education for the consumer just leads to, you know, more understanding and the ability to make better decisions, you know. That's everybody needs to be pursuing that.
For sure. I'm wary of the time. We're coming up to an hour now, but I just wanted to touch on some maybe practical advice for those people out there who may be roasters buying green coffee, or they may be way further down the chain, venue operators who serve coffee, but it may not be their primary or secondary revenue stream. What are your sort of top chunks of advice in helping people choose where to buy coffee from or buying the right coffee for them?
I think ask questions. You know, part of our job, a large part of it is educating people and explaining the things and what we do in the processes and why the coffee tastes like that and what the best fit is for your venue. And I think that's important. I think having a clear and concise price point about what you want, you know, is very helpful as well. And I guess maybe treat coffee the same way that you would, you know, the local produce that you buy and you know how you value that. Maybe that's a way that you should look at your coffee offering as well. Obviously, you know, a lot of restaurants, coffee isn't really the primary focus of what they're doing. It will be food and wine ahead of that. But I think it's nice if it's possible for you to do that. Ask the questions, set the standard for what you want when you're buying coffee from a roaster or even from a distributor, as you know, restaurants do, and just be honest and upfront about what you want from the product.
Yeah, great. Excellent. Aislinn?
I feel like this is really obvious, but like if you're buying cheap coffee, at some point someone in the supply chain is getting squeezed. And it's probably the producing communities. So like you can't always tell that expensive coffee is sourced in a way that's really responsible or sustainable, but you always know that cheap coffee that comes with an espresso machine and 3 grinders is not being paid for fairly down the line. So just, avoid it. And then I think beyond that, like Jules said, like ask questions, investigate, like try and find people that you trust and you feel aligned with, and people who are, you can see that they're continually trying to better their practices and learn more, because no one is like doing everything right. But I think people who are pursuing more information to improve their practices are people that you want to be working with,
Yeah.
Going to get there faster than someone who's not talking about it at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like the idea of approaching coffee the same way you would your fruit and vegetables, or your poultry, or your meat, or your fish. I think that's something that coffee is often relegated to. It's just above cleaning products, basically, or so I think that's really good advice. And asking questions is just so crucial, isn't it? I think that people definitely have a strong opinion on what they like, and often I think I've found that a lot of the people that I know who aren't in coffee tend to not enjoy the specialty coffee profile. But I think that there is so much diversity within that little bracket that there's always going to be something for someone. And the other thing that I've noticed as well is that I've seen roasters suggest other roasters who might be a better fit.
Absolutely.
Which is really great as well.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're kind of close. I'm just looking through my list of questions, and we've kind of done a pretty good job at covering most of it. So we'll wrap up now. Thank you so much to both of you for taking the time. I know that this is going to be super valuable for the Worksmith community who may or may not be in coffee. And I think that we've brought it to a really nice level for them to fully comprehend what our challenge is in coffee. So I thank you again for taking the time.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having us.
Great. I'll see you both really soon.
Okay. Bye.